Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
A diesel-powered engine on a farm works hard and operates in a grueling environment. Soy biodiesel fuels stand up to the challenge of powering farm equipment, but are also renewable and environmentally responsible as well. The Nebraska Soybean Board is committed to encouraging the use of soy biodiesel to protect the environment and sustain Nebraska's agriculture. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Roy Smith looks at how corn and soybean markets are handling the beginning of harvest. Nathan Kauffman talks with us about the state of the U.S. economy. Aaron Berger discusses weaning calves and windrow grazing, and Al Dutcher gives his weekly weather forecast. Roy Smith is our grain marketing analyst this week. The latest crop conditions report shows the country's farmers have harvested 7% of their corn and 3% of their soybeans. Nebraska producers are only 6 percentage points behind the state's 5-year average, with 4% of corn picked, but close to the average in beans with 3% of harvest complete. While markets have been relatively calm this week in comparison to the past few, the USDA will release its latest grain stocks report Monday, which may or may not make a difference. We started our discussion with Roy Wednesday afternoon by asking about the progress underway near the Plattsmouth area.
Just getting started with the harvest. Very few beans done, a few fields of corn here and there done. We started Monday and thinking we were going to go full steam, and found out that it was a little wetter than we anticipated, so the sound you hear in the background is a dryer fan running.
The sense you get from the national crop is what? What do you think this crop might look like across the country as you see or read things online?
It's been interesting following the commentary online and also on the various news services. Some of the areas that we normally expect to have really outstanding yields, Iowa, Illinois, and to a certain extent southern Minnesota, they're thinking their yields aren't going to be that great. And you know, I guess I would have maybe said that too about eastern Nebraska, but the corn that we combined really is coming out, we're probably going to get our APH yield or maybe a little better than that, so you can't complain about that.
Yeah, Iowa and maybe Illinois, even Nebraska might be a little lower than average, but the East Coast kind of looks like it might make up for that. On the flip side, it doesn't look like at this point frost is going to be a major concern. We might kind of dash that one.
Yeah, well, we're always concerned about frost at some point, and the concern this year has kind of come and gone, and it doesn't seem like people are too worried about it. I think maybe the thing that we need to be concerned about as individual farmers is if this crop was planted late and then we had a relatively cool spell this summer, a lot of people are probably going to find out, like I did, that when you pull into the field, that corn is not as ripe or not as dry as we thought it was. And at some point that may get to be a concern individually, but probably nationwide it's irrelevant.
As harvest starts to roll around here, what are you noticing as those loads start to roll into the elevator as far as basis goes?
Well, the basis kind of came unglued this week, like it does in most years when you have a good crop coming, and that is that, for instance, earlier this week I was in the elevator and they were offering a 40-cent a bushel premium for corn to be delivered this week. And Wednesday afternoon I was in there getting some moisture tests, and that 40 cents had turned into 11 cents, and probably by the time you hear this it'll be zero.
Well, let's not go too far now. We don't want to be too negative. Beans have really not had any fuel to get going. They shed a lot of money off the contract last week. And with tight stocks that a lot of people think are there doesn't seem to be anything that really gets them going.
It was an interesting thing to watch because, as you know, one of my standard sayings is you need to sell beans the day before the September crop report. This year it would have been worked better to sell them the day of the September crop report, but still that's pretty close. But I had people say, well, I'm not going to do that this year because stocks are so tight that beans are bound to go up. So what happened? They went down 70 cents. And then I get phone calls, why did they do that? Well, there's a psychology there that says that there's a harvest coming. The processors know that in a week or 2 weeks, if they're patient, that there'll be beans sold, and so they're not going to pay up for them like they might in a month or so when the harvest is getting pretty well out of the way and we have that proverbial dead cat bounce. And so, we had all those things going on. It made for an interesting week, and for those who sold the day before the September crop report, it was a pretty happy occasion.
Where could you see the harvest lows being for corn and soybeans?
Very reliable in soybeans for the harvest low to be around the 2nd of October, and for corn it's about the same date, maybe a little less reliable, but it's kind of interesting to lay out those charts and see the corn and soybean futures and see 20 years of history or 5 years of history, doesn't much matter. 1st of October is a day to kind of hang your hat on in terms of expecting to see the price go up after that. And so, I hope it works that way this year.
What are you looking at in the December charts? The last time we were here, you mentioned that December might show something of a rally. Does that still hold true?
Well, I certainly hope so. On Wednesday of this week, we saw a little bit of a reversal in the soybean market where the beans started out lower and ended up closing higher on the day. And the commentary was that the commercials are back in the market buying. Well, that's two things that favor the possibility of a little dead cat bounce coming here, and that is that we got some real honest demand from the commercials, and we've got that little bit of a reversal in the charts for the speculators to hang their hat on. So, there's some interesting things going on here, and I certainly hope we've seen the lowest price of the year and we can get a nice rebound off of this.
Again, the USDA is slated to release its next grain stocks report at 11 a.m. Central on Monday. We'll discuss those numbers as well as other corn and soybean market issues with Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners on next week's show. September is Renewable Fuels Month in Nebraska. While the state does have some solar and wind power generation, the majority of Nebraska's contribution to renewable fuels comes in the forms of ethanol and biodiesel. Nebraska ranks second in ethanol production, generating more than 13% of the nation's total operating production. And a recent United Soybean Board study shows biodiesel contributed to a $15 billion increase in soybean oil revenues between 2006 and 2012, raising the price of soybeans by 74 cents per bushel. Renewable fuels have also helped employ more than 1,500 people in rural Nebraska. We'll take an in-depth look at renewable fuels in the state during next week's episode. The United States' real gross domestic product, technically defined as the output of goods and services produced by labor and property located here in the U.S., grew 2.5% in the second quarter of 2013. That number was far better than the first quarter's real GDP increase of 1.1%. Unemployment stands at 7.3%, the lowest since December 2008. Nebraska's unemployment rate, meanwhile, is much lower at 4.2%. Yet each job report, on the national level at least, seems to bring hesitation from those who believe the numbers hide the true status of many job seekers. And the U.S. stock market last week hit a new record after the Federal Reserve announced it would maintain its current economic stimulus effort. While agriculture has fared better through recent sluggish years, increased land prices and other outside factors could pull that success closer to average. In a recent report from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, Nathan Kauffman and Jason Henderson detailed the wealth effect in U.S. agriculture and noted the USDA is predicting net farm incomes during 2014 to fall 20 to 25% below 2013 highs and remain there over the next decade. We recently sat down with Nathan to discuss Nebraska's high agricultural land prices, record farm incomes, and the current state of the U.S. economy.
I think that overall the U.S. economy has been recovering, albeit fairly slowly. There are indications that some of the sectors have been doing very well. Housing has been doing very well. Manufacturing is another sector that's shown some improvements. What it's not translating, though, it's not translating so much into job growth. And speaking specifically for Nebraska, that's been the story. Manufacturing has been strong, or relatively strong recently. A lot of that is food processing and machinery. That's a strength for Nebraska. The housing market has been doing fairly well. So those areas have been doing well, but it's not necessarily translating into a lot of job growth for the nation or for the state in particular. So I think that overall the economy has been expanding, but at a slower pace than what some might deem ideally.
Right.
And especially as it relates to employment numbers.
How has ag been able to capitalize on the value of the dollar as they export goods to other countries, namely China, obviously, and how might that differ going forward?
So the value of the dollar is key for exports in the sense that when the dollar is low, then other countries can import U.S. products at a lower relative price. And so a lower dollar value is a boost to exports. When the value of the dollar rises, then that's the reverse action, is that commodities get more costly and they may look elsewhere to import those commodities. So when you think about, for example, the value of the dollar versus the value of the Brazilian currency, for example, which has fallen quite a bit, that's a boost to the Brazilian commodity export market, but would present some challenges for the U.S. market. So there's a lot of interaction there between different countries, and when we export to China, China has been a huge player in ag export markets, and it's been driving a lot of the growth. But the dollar is an important factor, and especially to consider relative to other countries out there that are also big exporters.
Let's talk about agricultural land prices. This is probably a common trait throughout the Midwest, but Nebraska alone rose 25% last year. Is that a level of concern, or is that something that is safe because a lot of people are doing it in cash?
I think that there's a little bit of both. There are a lot of operations out there that own their operations and they own their land debt-free. There are, however, some operations that are much more highly leveraged. And so when we think about the possibility of something that could potentially turn into a bust akin to the 1980s, that's where we try to monitor that, is in the way of debt. And so there are some operations out there that are a little bit more highly leveraged. I think that there are a lot of people that look at farmland prices and think that it's not sustainable. One of the ways to think about that is in comparing it to, for example, the stock market, and look at the land value to rent ratio as a good proxy. Right now in this area we're typically at about 32 to 33, which means that investors would invest $32 for $1 worth of returns. The historical average for that is about 15 to 18, so we're much higher. The historical average for the S&P 500 and where it currently is right now is about 15 to 16. And so when you think about of land as an investment, and lots of other factors go into the purchase of farmland, as an investment, you might lead to the conclusion then that those prices are definitely higher than where they've been historically and higher by comparison to other investment options.
Right, and in sustainability overall in that, farm prices income cannot keep up like it has been going so far. Over the last year or two.
That's right, and you mentioned China. China and ethanol have been two of the main demand factors that have driven commodity prices the last several years. Now we're starting to see biofuel markets slow down a little bit in terms of reaching that plateau. There's some questions about growth coming from China. And so there's some real demand questions out there, and in the meantime we're seeing a supply response to high prices, and that's been driving prices down further. So thinking about what it costs to produce a bushel of corn on an acre of land versus what you get for that bushel of corn in the market, it's very different now, and it's very different potentially going forward than where it has been the last couple of years.
Crop farmers with irrigation did well this last year. They'll probably do well again this year, but farmers or ranchers with livestock probably didn't do quite as great. What's your impression of how this multi-year drought has impacted producers across this multi-state region?
Yeah, it's been especially pronounced out in the western plains and in the southern plains into Texas. We hear a lot of stories coming out of Texas. There was a processing plant in Texas that closed down earlier this year just because there simply wasn't enough out there in order to maintain that kind of capacity. They've been enduring high feed prices for a couple of years now. These have been losses that have persisted now for a couple of years. I think there's some real concerns about what that industry looks like going forward, some concerns about what demand, especially export demand, looks like especially for the cattle side. Hogs has been a little bit different. We've seen a little bit more export demand. Again, China is a big player there as well. So I would say that there's still some concerns about what happens in the cattle sector.
You've done some work on young and beginning farmers. Tell me the difficulties that they face that their predecessors maybe didn't face.
Yeah, quite simply, it is that in order to get started in agriculture, it's very, very costly. And young and beginning farmers that are trying to get started have limited equity, they have very limited collateral that they can provide for loans, and so thinking about getting started in an operation that's as capital intensive as what agriculture is difficult. And so that's one of the factors contributing to why it's difficult to think about the transition from an older generation to a younger generation. And there's lots of other factors again there that go into it. But that's one of the challenges that young and beginning farmers are going to face, is just simply the cost that's necessary to get started in agriculture.
What's the solution to that? Merely renting?
I think that's where the trend has been going the last few years, especially with where farmland prices have been headed. There was this trend that was developing up to the mid-2000s anyway, where more and more younger farmers were actually full owners of the land that they operated. That trend has kind of reversed a little bit now, so that you do see a few more out there that are renting a larger share of the land that they operate, and there may be a tendency to go further down that route.
Nathan's recent report detailing the challenges facing young farmers includes a telling stat on technological advancements on the farm. According to the USDA, in the 1880s, to produce 100 bushels of corn, it took about 40 hours of labor. Today, it takes less than 2. As producers look at feeding their cattle this fall and winter, UNL Extension educator Berger says Nebraska's weather patterns support windrow grazing, especially in central and western Nebraska. The method can cut down on cost while maintaining the forage's quality. Earlier this week, we talked with Aaron about windrow grazing, but first we discussed weaning calves from cows. Farmers and ranchers might be starting the process, and Aaron says the first goal in taking calves off should be to minimize stress.
Yeah, when you think about that calf being weaned, we're really having quite a few traumatic events happen in that calf's life there at weaning. We're removing that calf from the cow where that was its sole focus there from birth till that time, and that was its part of the herd there. And so we're not only breaking the bond there with that calf, and also asking it to start eating new feeds. And so anything we can do to reduce that stress is really a beneficial thing. So one of the things I think as we think about weaning, anything we can do to maybe use a two-step process there to wean that calf, either fence line weaning where that calf still has some interaction with the cow over a period of time but isn't able to nurse, or there's some tools available like nose weaners that keep the calf from nursing but allow it still to have social contact with the cow. And there's some good data and research that has shown kind of a two-step process can really be effective in helping reduce stress at weaning. Some other things we can do is prepare that calf for weaning by having a good herd health plan in place, by having some pre-weaning vaccinations and a good vaccination protocol set out ahead of time and have that in place so that that calf is ready to encounter the challenges that are going to come with the weaning process. Also introducing the calf to some some feed prior to weaning that you're going to be feeding it after that weaning occurs allows it to get used to what that feed will be and really provides that calf with an opportunity to start getting used to the changes that are coming.
How effective can fence line weaning be, Aaron?
Fence line weaning can really be a very effective process. Really what's happening there is we're going to either take the calves and put them right across the fence from the cows. It's oftentimes even a good idea to maybe have those calves actually stay in the same pasture across the fence from where their cows were, so they're used to where the water source is and the feed is. A fence line weaning can work very well using an electric fence. If the cattle have been acclimated to that prior to weaning, it can be a very effective tool as long as we're getting a good ground on that fence when the calves are exposed to it so they can see each other, smell each other, but they're not crossing that barrier and not nursing.
Overall, the goal, Aaron, is to just reduce the stress and therefore any possible sickness that could overcome it.
That's right. Anything that's stressful to the calf is going to be challenging. When that calf is stressed, it's going to be bawling. Oftentimes in the fall of the year, we have dusty conditions, so anything we can do to reduce that dust that would be irritating to the lungs of the calf is important as well. And so reducing stress will help to keep that calf healthy, get them started on feed quickly, and make the adjustment through that weaning process.
As we go further into fall, one technique that you think producers might want to take advantage of is windrow grazing. Why might that be something that you would want to try?
Windrow grazing, I think, really has a fit as a tool to reduce harvested feed cost. And really what we do when we windrow graze is in this early fall of the year, we're going to go out, windrow that crop just like we were if we were going to put it up as hay, but we leave those windrows in the field. This really works effectively, especially with annual forages, things like foxtail millet, sudan grass, sorghum sudan, pearl millet. It can also work with perennial forages, like if you have a last cutting of alfalfa, if we would have an extended fall. Once that alfalfa gets to mid to late October, it's hardened off enough that it can go ahead and be cut. And sometimes we can anticipate a really hard freeze that's coming that's going to stop all growth and begin to wilt that alfalfa. Going out and windrowing that right prior to that event allows us to preserve the quality of that, to hold it in the windrow. And then here in Nebraska, we really have some seasonality of precip. 80% of our precip comes in the months of really March through September. So windrowing that crop in late September, early October really allows us to preserve quality through the October, November into late February, early March timeframe with minimal deterioration.
Does it matter, Aaron, east versus west Nebraska as far as if you would lose those nutrients in the grasses?
Yeah, if you think about precip from west to east, obviously the further east we go, the higher precip we get. So obviously I think western Nebraska lends itself more to windrow grazing than maybe places east of the 100th meridian. But I also think if you're planning to utilize windrow grazing, it's very possible to utilize it in eastern Nebraska. You just may need to think about strategically using that forage earlier, maybe in that November, December timeframe, rather than letting it just lay there until we get into that February, March timeframe.
UNL Extension has additional resources on weaning, calves, and windrow grazing. We'll link to that information on the Market Journal homepage. Windmills have historically been a common sight across the farms and grasslands of Nebraska. In the September Nebraska Farmer, you can read about a windmill factory museum in Nebraska City that displays some of the many Nebraska-made windmills. Originally, Eli brand windmills were manufactured at the Kriegel factory, but today the factory is a museum. It celebrated its grand opening in April. You can read more about the importance of windmills to Nebraska's history and the museum in the September Nebraska Farmer. Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's UNL Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are for the weekly forecast. We did, in this last 7 days, see a fairly significant little mid-level low that moved across the state that brought some very welcome moisture to a sizable portion of the panhandle. And when we say welcome moisture, generally 1 to upwards of 3 inches of rainfall was reported at least across the eastern 2/3 of the panhandle. Very, very welcome, considering that we've had some problems last year in regards to wheat planting, so we've got the moisture now for good wheat establishment, and potentially, if we can get some further events, have the ability to start rapidly rebuilding soil moisture profiles in anticipation of next cropping season. Now, as you move further east, of course, we did not see nearly as aggressive a precipitation pattern, although some areas did receive some isolated heavy thunderstorm activity. There was a line that developed across southeast Nebraska, so we are getting a little bit more active weather than we were here a month ago. I wish we could have gotten that precip then. Unfortunately, it is what it is. But at least we're getting some semblance of a regular frequency of storms moving through our region. And that does give us some encouraging prospects for building up subsoil moisture recharge before we get into the winter period, and maybe ease the pressure a little bit in regards to drought signatures as we go into next spring. So time will tell. In regards to this 7-day forecast period, once again, we have a system that has moved through the state and will be exiting as we go through this weekend, bringing some rather cool temperatures, and then we go back through the roller coaster ride. So let's take a look at how the upper air models are projecting our weather as we go through this next 7-day period. And the system that came through over the last 24 hours across the state with the sharp cold front is now moving across the upper Great Lakes. And so we should see the shower activity here in eastern Nebraska come to an end during the first half of the day, and we'll see clearing skies develop from west to east as the day progresses. As we go into tomorrow, we'll start to see some ridging taking place. Looks like it'll be a fairly blah day in terms of precipitation, but if you like sunny weather, this should be a fairly nice day across the state as the ridge tries to build in temporarily. We do see a trough coming into the Pacific Northwest, and it looks to be a fairly weak one. So we'll continue to see light ridging. Nothing in the way of any precipitation expected on Monday. Should be a very nice day with temperatures primarily in the 70s to possibly the low 80s across the south part of the state. As we go into Tuesday, this little system moves across the northern plains region. That may bring some cloudiness and maybe a sprinkle or so to portions of northern Nebraska. Less of a chance as you get to southern Nebraska. But overall, we're only going to see a couple degree cool down as the system moves toward the Great Lakes. And as we get into Wednesday, we'll see that first system moves out. We'll get another little brief period of warming. and a more significant trough looks like it's poised to make its way into our region, particularly as we get to the later half of the week. Now, as we go into Thursday, we'll see that that trough starts to dig across toward the western Great Lakes. We do have the chance for some precipitation, particularly Wednesday afternoon, evening, all the way through midday Thursday before we start to see the cold air rapidly pulling in behind this system. And we'll see a significant drop in temperatures, particularly as we get into the day on Friday, as the system starts to intensify over the western Great Lakes. It's really going to pull the cold air down, and it would not surprise me that we will see a killing freeze across a good portion of the eastern Dakotas and possibly even eastern Nebraska. So if we look at this temperature forecast, we will see the roller coaster where we start cool, start to warm up into the 70s to the 80s, and then as we get to late next week, notice those 53-degree highs in the northeast, indicating very cold weather coming in. 8 to 14-day forecast continues to point to warmer conditions to our west with the cool conditions to our southeast. In terms of precipitation, shown below normal precipitation, but we do have a fairly significant system coming in later next week that's likely to undo some of this projection, at least here in Nebraska.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews with Roy Smith, Nathan Kauffman, and Aaron Berger, as well as Al's weekly forecast, are available on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. Next week, we'll take a look at Nebraska's renewable fuel sources, and Jeff Peterson will be our grain marketing analyst. Until then, thanks for joining us. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll talk to you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Soybeans are found on dinner tables around the world. Some form of the soybean is found in baby foods, snacks, cooking oils, and many other food items eaten daily. And soybeans provide the protein in the diets for livestock and fish. The Nebraska soybean farmers support research to develop new soy-based products for foods, livestock, and industrial uses through their checkoff dollars. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The Soybean Checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.